He married her for business. She carried his children in silence. What would you do if the person you love most didn't believe you were capable of being loved at all? Ellie was a secretary, quiet, reliable, invisible in the world she worked in. Clayton was a billionaire CEO, cold and controlled, shaped by power and betrayal. Their paths crossed for one reason: legacy. When Clayton asked her to marry him, it wasn't for love, it was to fulfill a condition in his father's will. 1 year, no strings, no feelings. But behind every carefully signed contract was a heart she had quietly given him long before he ever noticed her. Then came the impossible 2 pink lines. And the moment she needed him most, he turned away. Would you stay silent to protect someone's pride? Would you walk away, carrying a secret they were never brave enough to believe? This is not a fairy tale. It's a story about second chances, soft forgiveness, and the kind of love that grows not from passion, but from choosing each other every single day. If this story touches you, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to support the channel by subscribing. Now, let us tell you the story she'll one day tell her children. She had never imagined her name would ever appear on a marriage certificate beside her boss's. But when Clayton Redstone asked her to marry him, not for love, but for legacy, Ellie couldn't stop the ache in her chest, because this wasn't the first time she said yes, just the first time he asked. Eleanor Grace Whitmore. Ellie, to everyone who dared get close, had worked in the corner office of Redstone Industries for nearly 6 years. She was never late, never loud, and never anything other than reliable. The kind of woman people trusted to keep their secrets, hold their calendars, and remember how they took their coffee while forgetting, somehow, to ask her how she took her own. Charleston bustled outside those tall glass windows. But Ellie lived in a quieter world, a world of half-finished grocery lists folded in her purse, of calendars marked in pencil, of one good pair of heels and a coat she'd never replaced, though the cuffs were worn soft as paper. And in that world, Clayton Redstone was the storm she never let herself step into. He was everything she was not: loud in success, sharp in logic, magnetic in a way that unsettled every room he entered. People didn't meet Clayton. They circled him, carefully, like birds around thunder. And she took his calls, scheduled his flights, kept his secrets, and watched him leave again and again for dinners she'd never be invited to, until the day he didn't leave. That Thursday had begun like any other. Cool spring air outside, the scent of brewing coffee inside. She'd placed his briefing on the corner of the desk at exactly 8:59, like always. And just as she turned to leave, he spoke without lifting his head. "Ellie," he said. His voice carried the same weight it always had measured, unhurried, a tone used by men who knew they would be obeyed. But what came next stopped her cold. "I need to get married." She had smiled, reflexively, a nervous tick, maybe a joke. But then he looked up, and the cool gray in his eyes was anything but casual. "I'm serious," he continued. "It's a clause, my father's will. If I want to retain controlling interest in the company, Redstone stays in my hands, I have to be legally married by my 44th birthday." "That's in 6 months," she said slowly, still not fully believing where this was going. He nodded. "And I don't trust strangers." Ellie felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet. A tightness climbed into her throat. "You don't have to answer right now," he added, "but I need someone I can depend on, someone discreet, and there's no one I trust more than you." Her heart made a strange, traitorous sound, somewhere between hope and warning. That night, Ellie lay awake in her apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ache of memory. Her last relationship had ended with silence and a half-packed box by the door. Love, she'd learned, was not something you gave lightly, especially not to someone who wouldn't know what to do with it. But this wasn't love, not on paper. Still, she remembered the way Clayton once paused when she handed him a cup of coffee, how his eyes had softened, just for a breath, or how his voice was quieter when he said her name. Ellie. Those things weren't promises, but they were something. And so, On a rainy Monday morning, she walked into his office in a navy blue dress and said, simply, "Yes." He didn't smile. He didn't reach for her hand. He just nodded and slid a folder across the desk. Inside a prenup, a confidentiality agreement, a checklist for the courthouse. There, in clean legalese, were the rules of their marriage: 12 months, no expectations, no public displays, no strings. Just long enough, he said, to keep Redstone intact, and that should have been the end of it, except for the pause the moment he looked away when she asked, "And after a year, we annul or divorce. Whatever's cleanest." His voice was steady, but his eyes found the window instead of hers. That night, Ellie packed her life into 2 suitcases and a duffel. She left her apartment key on the kitchen counter. The landlord could find someone new. She wouldn't be back. Outside, Charleston was thick with early spring air, warm and wet with promise. When she stepped from the cab in front of Redstone Manor, she hesitated. The house was stone and steel, old money draped in ivy and pride. It loomed not just large, but intentional. As if meant to remind you that you didn't belong here unless you were invited or born, Ellie tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase. The gate creaked open. Somewhere behind those walls, a man waited, not for love, not for romance, but for a deal. And yet, her heart was not made of clauses and conditions. It was old-fashioned, foolish, even it remembered how to ache. She took a breath, deep and shaking, and stepped inside. Not just the house, but his world. She hadn't just stepped into a house. She'd stepped into a life with a man who had no idea he'd already been loved, quietly, faithfully, for a very long time. In a house where silence spoke louder than affection. Ellie learned to measure love in the smallest gestures: a morning cup of coffee, a passing glance, an umbrella held in the rain. Redstone Manor was beautiful in a way that didn't ask to be loved. It simply stood cold, perfect, untouchable. A house built on pride and legacy, not warmth. It had witnessed wealth, power, and polished shoes walking across its marble floors for generations. But it had never been asked to hold tenderness, and neither had Clayton Redstone. The day Ellie moved in, a staff member handed her a printed household schedule: breakfast times, security codes, cleaning rotations, and then left her to find her own place inside it. There was no welcoming toast, no shared dinner, just 2 separate bedrooms on opposite ends of a hallway that felt longer than her hometown's only street. The first morning of their marriage, she woke up early, too early. She wandered the house barefoot, her footsteps echoing through the hallways like apologies. At exactly 7 a.m., she found the kitchen and made his coffee. Black, 1 sugar. Just like always. She placed the mug exactly where he preferred it, at the corner of the marble island. Handle turned outward. Napkin folded beneath, then stepped aside. He entered right on cue, dressed, precise, unreadable. His eyes passed over her, then settled on the cup. "Thank you," he said, low and brief, before taking his first sip. That was it. No smile, no eye contact, but also no rejection. It was a beginning, however small. Each day followed the same muted pattern. Clayton worked late, ate alone. Ellie floated in the background like soft wallpaper, useful, quiet, easily overlooked. But Ellie noticed everything. She noticed how he always left the door slightly open when he showered, perhaps from habit, or maybe because silence unsettled him too. She noticed how he never turned on the TV in the evenings, preferring to read with a single lamp lit. She noticed how he paused when she entered the room, even if he never acknowledged it. And slowly, she began to learn the rhythm of his silences. There were different kinds. The kind that said, "I'm busy." The kind that whispered, "I don't know how to say this." And the kind that hovered, almost tender, like his heart was standing just behind a locked door. She never forced it open. Instead, she began showing up in ways that didn't make noise. Folding his scarf when the weather turned cold, refilling the kettle before bed, leaving fresh lemons by the sink because he liked them with his water in the morning. These weren't grand gestures, but they were hers, and slowly, she began to notice how he responded. He started drinking the tea she made without asking. He moved his meetings to earlier slots so they both returned home before dark. He started looking up when she entered a room. One day, as spring gave way to early summer, rain began falling fast and hard while she waited by the curb after a company charity event. She had refused a driver, preferring the walk. When she stepped outside, someone was already there, Clayton, holding an umbrella. He didn't say a word, just tilted it over her head and walked her to the car. In the silence, Ellie felt her chest tighten, not with love, not yet, but with the sense that someone had seen her, protected her, even if he couldn't name it. Days later, she found herself wandering the house during a rare afternoon off. The sky outside was heavy with gray. She wandered into the library, perhaps the only room in the house untouched by marble. It smelled of cedar and stories. As she trailed her hand across the books, she felt her breath slow. Here, finally, she felt herself again. "You read?" came a voice behind her. She turned. Clayton stood in the doorway, one hand in his pocket. "I do," she said, steady but soft. "What kind?" he asked. She hesitated. "The quiet kind, where not much happens, but everything matters." His eyes softened, slightly. There was a beat of stillness. Then he asked, "Where did you grow up?" Ellie blinked. No one ever asked that. She tucked her hands into her sleeves. "Kansas, a town so small you could blink and miss it. My parents still live there. Dad sings in the church choir. Mama bakes too much and worries more." She chuckled. And in that moment, something shifted in Clayton's face, not just curiosity, but familiarity, like he was seeing something he remembered from long ago, though he'd never had it himself. That night, Ellie slept lighter. She dreamed of open skies and the scent of home. And for the first time in a long while, she woke with a sense that something invisible had moved, not between them, but within him. The next evening, she returned home after a walk through the gardens. The manor glowed with that soft, late spring light that turned everything gold. As she entered the dining room, she stopped. There, at her place on the table, was a book, hardback, deep green, worn edges, The Winter Orchard, her favorite, a novel she'd once mentioned in passing years ago. During a lunch meeting, she had assumed he hadn't even heard. There was no note, no bookmark. Just the book, lay gently where she'd see it. She didn't cry, but she stood for a long moment with the book pressed to her chest and let herself believe, if only for one quiet second, that love, even the most unlikely kind, might not begin with fireworks, but with memory and a gesture as simple as a book on a table. She didn't need a letter. She didn't need words. The book said what he couldn't, and somewhere deep in her chest, hope stirred again, soft as a turning page. Clayton's mother believed appearances were everything, and nothing ruined appearances like an uninvited heart. The invitation arrived in an envelope thick with weight, literal and symbolic, cream-colored with gold embossing, sealed with a red wax crest shaped like a rose. Redstone Family Garden Gala. Ellie turned the envelope over in her hands more times than she cared to admit. There was no note, no greeting, just her name printed in clean, sterile font. No warmth, no welcome. When she asked Clayton whether she should attend, he simply said, "You can, if you want, no pressure, no preference." But she knew better. Events like these weren't just for society. They were about society. Appearances, allegiances, hierarchies polished like heirloom silver. And wives, real or paper, were expected to be part of the show. So, she went. The night of the gala was warm, the kind of southern spring evening that felt like the world was leaning toward summer. The garden at Redstone Manor had been transformed. Thousands of fairy lights weaved through magnolia branches. Soft jazz floated through the air, and Charleston's elite glittered beneath the stars in tuxedos and silk. Ellie arrived in a dress that took her 3 weeks to find. Navy chiffon, floor length, simple but elegant. Nothing too bold, nothing too loud, just enough to say I see the rules. I'm playing too. As she stepped onto the manicured lawn, heads turned. She felt it whispers just behind glasses of champagne, eyes pretending not to stare. She found a quiet place near the hydrangeas, letting the crowd move around her like a tide. She was used to observing. It felt safer that way. Clayton found her there. He looked sharp, as always, tailored suit, silver cufflinks, an expression somewhere between calculated and distracted. But when he saw her, something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, not admiration, just pause. You came, he said. I was invited, she answered, gently. He offered his arm. She hesitated just a second, then took it. Together, they entered the current of Charleston's most powerful bankers, socialites, politicians with sculpted smiles and generational wealth. Clayton greeted them with ease, trained charm, and the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. Ellie stood beside him, quiet, composed. She smiled when appropriate, nodded when spoken to, and sipped sparkling water instead of wine. She knew how this world worked, even if she didn't belong to it. And then came her Marilyn Redstone. She didn't arrive. She descended in a cream satin gown, with pearls that looked like heirlooms and posture carved from marble. Clayton's mother moved through the garden like she owned the ground beneath her heels, because, in many ways, she did. Clayton, she said, kissing his cheek with the softness of ceremony, always so punctual. Then her eyes turned to Ellie. They didn't soften. And you must be Eleanor. Ellie extended her hand. Mrs. Redstone? It's lovely to finally meet you. The older woman glanced at her hand like it was something unexpected on fine china. Of course, she said smoothly. The secretary? Ellie kept her smile, measured, calm. I was his secretary. She replied, softly. Now, I'm his wife. There was a beat, just long enough for others nearby to hear. Marilyn's smile didn't falter. Yes. Well, we all wear many hats. Some of us longer than others. She turned to greet another guest, dismissing Ellie like a closing door, but not before Ellie saw the gleam in her eyes, the quiet triumph of a woman who believed she'd just reminded someone of their place. Ellie excused herself and walked toward the fountain at the center of the garden. She needed air, space, something that didn't speak in code. Her heart thudded not from pain, not exactly, but from restraint. She wasn't humiliated. She'd been underestimated before. She was just tired of being small to people who didn't know how much she carried. And then, without warning, a hand slid gently into hers. Clayton, not stiff, not formal, just present. He didn't speak, didn't smile, just stood beside her. His mother was watching. So was half the garden. She's my wife, he said clearly. Not loudly, but with enough weight that the words landed like a bell ringing through velvet. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Ellie didn't look at him. She couldn't. Instead, she looked straight ahead and let the moment settle over them like dusk. His hand in hers wasn't warm, but it was real. He didn't let go, and neither did she. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and canapes. People were more polite after that. Not warmer, just more careful. Ellie noticed it. She saw the way some women tilted their heads in sympathy and others in silent challenge. But she didn't shrink. She stood straighter. After all, she hadn't married Clayton to become someone else. She'd married him knowing exactly who she was. And now, so did everyone else. When the last lantern dimmed and the music faded, Clayton walked her to the car. The ride home was quiet, but not hollow. Inside the manor, Ellie paused near the staircase, waiting for something. A word, a nod, anything. Clayton stood beside her, still holding his cufflink, as if unsure what to say. Finally, he met her eyes. "You handled that better than I would," he said. She nodded once. He turned and walked down the hallway, shoes silent on stone. Ellie remained for a long time, not because she didn't know what to do next, but because, for the first time in weeks, it felt like her silence wasn't empty. It was earned. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand grazing the banister. He hadn't apologized, he hadn't explained, but he'd held her hand, in public, in front of his mother, and somehow that said more than words ever could. A sudden snowstorm trapped them in the manor, but what froze the world outside quietly melted something inside. It had begun as flurries light, almost playful. Charleston rarely saw snow, and when it came, it rarely stayed. Ellie had stood by the window that morning, coffee in hand, watching the flakes swirl like feathers across the slate-colored sky. By noon, the wind howled. By 3, the power flickered. By evening, it was gone. The manor dimmed into a hushed stillness. Generators kicked in for essentials heat. A few overhead lights, but the Wi-Fi failed. Cell towers stalled, and the great halls fell quiet as a church after midnight. Ellie stood in the hallway, wrapped in an old wool cardigan, staring at the heavy drapes rustling in the draft. The silence felt different now, less polished, more human. Clayton appeared near the stairwell, phone in hand. No signal, he muttered, sliding it into his pocket. She nodded. No news, no emails. Might be the first time in 10 years I don't know what's happening at the office. She smiled, faintly. Maybe it's a gift. He looked at her like he wasn't sure whether to agree. By nightfall, the snow had blanketed the gardens, erasing paths, softening every sharp line. Ellie lit candles in the dining room and set a fire in the hearth like her father had taught her carefully, patiently, coaxing warmth from wood. Clayton didn't retreat to his office that night. Instead, he wandered into the drawing room where she sat curled up in an armchair with a blanket and an old copy of The Winter Orchard. He didn't interrupt, just stood near the fireplace, gazing into the flames. "You ever get snow in Kansas?" he asked after a while. "All the time," she said. "But we never let it stop anything. We'd bundle up and keep going. Power went out every few weeks in the winter. My mom taught piano by candlelight." He gave a small smile, not amused, just remembering something. Ellie watched him quietly. He looked different in the firelight, less like a CEO, more like a man caught in the soft moment between two choices. After dinner, which they ate in the quiet warmth of the kitchen, Ellie found herself drawn to the music room. She hadn't entered it since moving in. Not really. The piano sat under a thin film of dust, forgotten. She lifted the cover gently, ran her fingers across the keys. "You play Clayton's voice?" surprised her. "A little," she said. "Enough to remember my mother's favorite hymns." He nodded. "My father hated music, thought it was a distraction." There was no bitterness in his voice, just fact. She played anyway. Soft, unsure notes. A melody she half remembered. The sound echoed through the stone, as if the house itself were leaning in to listen. Clayton sat nearby, just listening. And for the first time since their marriage began, they shared a night that wasn't about contracts or silence, just presence. On the second day of the storm, Ellie baked biscuits from scratch, using a recipe scrawled on the back of a grocery receipt. The kitchen smelled of butter and flour, the windows fogged from the oven's warmth. Clayton helped dry dishes after, quietly, like he'd done it before, like he wasn't above it. They spoke of ordinary things, childhood stories, books they never finished, songs that reminded them of no one in particular. It wasn't romantic, but it was real. Later that night, while adding logs to the fire, Clayton sat back on the rug, arms resting on his knees. Ellie stayed on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her. A long pause stretched between them, filled only by the soft crackle of burning wood. "I was 20, he said suddenly. Just started working under my father, still trying to prove I was worth the last name. Ellie looked at him gently. He wasn't asking for pity. He was telling her something he hadn't said aloud in years. There was a car accident. I was driving back from a meeting. I don't even remember the crash. Just waking up, broken ribs, surgery, recovery. He rubbed the back of his neck. They told me I might not be able to have children. Nothing definitive, just unlikely. And my father, he was furious. Not about the accident, about the legacy. Ellie's heart clenched, not for the story itself, but for the way he told it, like a man who had built a life on pretending he didn't care. No one else knows, he added. Not even David. I just assumed it wasn't in the cards. Ellie didn't speak right away. She didn't fill the space with empty comfort. Instead, she said softly, that must have been heavy to carry alone. He nodded, eyes still on the fire. I stopped imagining things after that. A family, a real marriage. It all felt like something meant for other people. She wanted to reach out, to take his hand, but she didn't. Instead, she sat still, let the fire crackle, and offered the one thing he never got from the world, a place to rest. That night, the house hummed in low warmth, no screens, no sound, just snow falling like lullabies outside. Ellie passed by the study before going to bed and found him there curled in the armchair, head resting back, breath even and slow, sleeping, not collapsed from exhaustion, not guarded, just asleep. She stood in the doorway a long while, watching. His face was softer in sleep, almost boyish. Like the man he might have been had the world not asked him to be something else. She didn't wake him. Instead, she pulled the blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over his shoulders. Then she turned off the light. For the first time, Ellie saw not the tycoon, not the name on the building, but the man beneath the weight. And deep inside her, something began to shift quietly, steadily, like snow melting into spring. It was just a routine doctor's visit until the nurse smiled and said, "Congratulations." Ellie hadn't even wanted to go. It was just a checkup, something she scheduled weeks ago, after a strange wave of nausea had knocked her sideways 3 mornings in a row. She chalked it up to stress, weather, too much coffee. But now, sitting in a softly lit room with beige walls and a faint scent of antiseptic, she felt like the world had tilted slightly beneath her chair. She blinked. "Excuse me," the nurse smiled kindly, tapping the corner of the screen. "Your test came back positive. You're about 6 weeks along." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Pregnant. She felt like someone had taken a snow globe and shaken it violently. Memories, emotions, fears tumbling in a blur of swirling white. She left the office in a daze, barely noticing the spring drizzle beginning to fall. The world felt impossibly loud. Her footsteps echoed on the wet pavement, as if every step was a question she didn't yet know how to answer. Back at the manor, she sat in the window seat of the guest room, her favorite place on quiet mornings, and pressed her palm gently to her belly. She didn't feel anything, not yet, but something was there. A life, tiny, quiet, but real, a child, Clayton's child. The irony of it pierced her chest like a quiet laugh with no joy. He had told her clearly, painfully, that he didn't believe he could ever be a father, that his body wasn't made for it, that his life wasn't meant to hold something so fragile. And now, this, she wanted to feel joy. But joy was tangled with fear, with the echo of his voice from that night by the fire, with the weight of knowing this wasn't part of the plan. Their marriage had come with terms, boundaries, a timeline, and no children. Still, she waited 2 days before telling him. Not because she was hiding, but because she was gathering courage. Because some things needed space before they could be spoken aloud. She found him in the study, standing at the window with a glass of bourbon in one hand, his phone in the other. The storm had passed, but clouds still hung low, stubborn and gray. "Clayton," she said softly. He looked up. Yes, she didn't walk toward him, just stood near the doorway, hands folded, I went to the doctor this week. He nodded, distracted. Everything all right? She hesitated. Then I'm pregnant. Silence. The word hung in the air like dust suspended in sunlight, visible, heavy, undeniable. He blinked once, then again. No, he said, not like a question, like a verdict. She felt her breath catch. It's true, she said. The test, I don't need a test. He cut in. His voice was sharper than she'd heard in months. I need the truth. Her heart sank, slowly, like something precious slipping beneath ice. I am telling you the truth. He set the glass down hard on the window ledge, the clink louder than it needed to be. You think I'll believe that's my child? His words were a whip, cold, precise. Ellie's throat tightened. She stared at him, searching for the man who had listened to her play piano, who had sat beside her during the snowstorm, who had reached for her hand in front of a garden full of strangers. But that man was gone now. All that stood before her was a fortress, stone and fury. You told me you couldn't, she began, her voice breaking. I told you it was unlikely. And now, 6 years you work for me, 6 months you live in my house. And suddenly, this... He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The venom was in the restraint. I never asked for this. He said, softer now. But somehow, the softness cut deeper. And I never gave you the impression that I wanted to be a father. Ellie took a slow breath. Her hands trembled. No, she whispered. You didn't. She turned, slowly, walked out of the study. Her steps were silent on the wood floors, but her pulse thundered in her ears. Upstairs, she didn't pack. There was no suitcase, no plan. She simply put on her coat, slipped her shoes on by the door, and stepped into the rain. It came down in sheets cold and relentless. But she didn't flinch. She walked past the front gate, past the hydrangeas now drooping with water, past the gravel path that had once felt like a bridge to something new. Tonight, it felt like an escape. There were no taxis at that hour, no umbrella. But she didn't care. All she carried was herself, and the small, flickering life growing quietly inside her. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay. She didn't bring a bag. She didn't bring a plan, only a broken heart, a silent goodbye, and the quiet, fragile heartbeat of someone who had no idea they'd already been abandoned. There's something about returning to your childhood home. Everything looks smaller, but the pain somehow feels bigger. The gravel road that led to the Whitmore farmhouse was still uneven, full of old potholes and half-hearted repairs that had held through decades of Kansas storms. Ellie's boots crunched over the stones as she walked from the bus stop, suitcase in one hand, heart in pieces in the other. The house came into view slowly, as it always had, white clapboard siding, a sagging front porch, wind chimes singing off-key in the breeze. The garden was overgrown. The fence still leaned eastward like it never quite recovered from the tornado back in '92, and yet, it was home. Nancy Whitmore opened the door with a towel over one shoulder and flour on her hands. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She just pulled Ellie into her arms and held her until her trembling stopped. That night, they sat at the kitchen table in near silence, sipping weak tea and watching the wind dance outside. Nancy placed a hand over her daughter's. You don't have to explain anything, she said gently. But you're not alone here. Ellie nodded, tears gathering behind her eyes like clouds that refused to burst. The days in Kansas passed in quiet, steady rhythms. Ellie fell back into old habits, waking at sunrise, feeding the chickens, weeding the overgrown rows of vegetables that once fed their family through lean winters. She slept in her childhood bedroom, now repainted a soft yellow, but still holding whispers of old posters and scrawled notes under the mattress. She folded tiny baby clothes at night, imagining what her children's laughter might sound like in the hallways where she once tiptoed after curfew. It was a life stripped bare of luxury, but full of something else, gentleness. Healing didn't come quickly, but it came. One morning, Nancy walked into the kitchen to find Ellie standing barefoot in the sunlight, humming as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. Her eyes were lighter, her shoulders less tense. "You look more like yourself," Nancy said. Ellie smiled. "I feel less like a ghost." At her second prenatal appointment in the small-town clinic, the nurse greeted her by name. The walls were painted sunflower yellow. There were magazines from last season on the table, and a crocheted baby blanket framed on the wall with a plaque beneath it, in memory of all our tiny miracles. Ellie lay on the exam table, heart fluttering beneath her ribs. "You're further along than we thought," the doctor said kindly, pressing the wand gently across her belly. The room was quiet, but for the whoosh of static. Then thump, 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 thump. A heartbeat, then another, two distinct rhythms, like a song meant for a duet. Ellie stared at the monitor, then at the doctor. "Is that—" "Yes," he said, smiling. "Twins." She laughed short and breathless, then covered her mouth as tears spilled out. Two, not just one, not just a surprise, but a miracle. Multiplied. Her mother cried when she heard. Cried in the way women do when they've held too many quiet griefs of their own. Then she went straight to the attic and brought down the old wooden cradle Ellie had slept in as a baby. They sanded and painted it together on the porch, layer by layer, until it gleamed again, weathered but ready. Each night, Ellie wrote in a small journal, not to herself, not even to the babies, but to the version of herself she hoped to become. "You are not broken," she wrote. "You are blooming in unfamiliar soil." Back in Charleston. Clayton sat behind his desk, untouched paperwork stacked in uneven piles. His eyes were sunken, jaw tighter than usual. He hadn't heard from Ellie since the night she left. No texts, no calls. At first, he thought it was temporary. Then, he told himself she needed space. Then, silence turned into weeks. David walked in that morning, hesitant. "I wasn't sure whether to tell you," he said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "But I thought you should know." Inside was a photograph, blurry, clearly taken on a phone through a clinic hallway window. Ellie, sitting on an exam table, one hand on her stomach, and beside it, a printed note. Whitmore, Billionaire, 12-week twin gestation. Clayton stared at it for a long time, long enough for the truth to catch up to the lie he'd told himself. He hadn't just hurt her. He'd abandoned her, and now, somewhere across the country, the woman who once sat beside him in silence was growing not one, but two lives without him. He held the photo in trembling hands, staring not at the clinic logo, not at the doctor's note, but at the woman who once stood beside him without asking for anything, and now carried everything he never knew he wanted. In the attic of the manor, beneath dust and years of silence, lay a letter never meant to be found. David hadn't planned to go into the attic. He was looking for old boardroom files, something left over from the Redstone estate audit, but the narrow pull-down stairs creaked with a sort of invitation, and curiosity led him up into a space thick with cobwebs and forgotten years. The attic smelled of cedar and old paper. Sunlight filtered through a single round window, illuminating stacks of boxes labeled in fading ink. Clayton, high school, Maryland, social, estate, 1986-1990. One trunk sat in the corner, locked but not latched, ornate, brass-edged, the kind of chest built to hold secrets. Inside, atop a folded American flag and a set of cufflinks, sat a thick envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. James Redstone. David hesitated. He wasn't one to pry. But something about the envelope heavy, sealed with wax, yet clearly addressed to no one, felt urgent. He opened it. Inside was a letter, dated over 20 years ago, written in the unsteady scrawl of a man nearing the end of his life. And it began, "To the son I never learned how to love properly." David read the entire thing in silence, his breath growing tighter with each line. The truth spilled out in sentences that trembled with regret. James had known Clayton was capable of fatherhood, but Marilyn had insisted on controlling the future. She had paid a doctor discreetly, efficiently to deliver a diagnosis that would close off the possibility. No children, no risk. No distractions from the Redstone Empire. Your mother wanted to preserve the name, but not the man. At the end of the letter was a line David couldn't stop rereading. If you ever find someone who softens the edges you've spent your life sharpening, don't let her go. Even if I never said it, I wanted more for you than what I taught you to be. David stood still for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. Then he folded it carefully, tucked it into his coat, and went to find Clayton. Clayton was in the garden. He had been spending more time outside lately, not pruning, not planting, just standing, watching the trees sway in the wind as if they might reveal something he couldn't name. David didn't say a word at first, just handed him the letter. Clayton read it slowly, once, then again. Then he sat down on the stone bench like his body had forgotten how to hold itself up. The world tilted. He remembered that doctor's visit, how clinical it had felt, how quickly the words were spoken, how little emotion was in the room. He had accepted it as truth. He'd built his life around it, armor made of silence. And it had all been false. His fists clenched, not in rage, but in something more dangerous: disbelief. His mother, his father, the entire foundation of his legacy, built on manipulation, control. He thought of Ellie, of the night she stood before him, trembling but brave, and told him the one thing he'd never allowed himself to hope for, and how he'd thrown it back at her like an accusation. Shame wrapped around his chest like a tightening rope. "She left carrying my children," he whispered, "and I made her believe she had to." David didn't answer. There was nothing to say. That night, Clayton climbed the attic stairs himself. He sat there for hours, reading every other note in the trunk, old letters, birthday cards. A sealed envelope marked "to be opened on Clayton's 40th. It was dated the day of his 40th birthday, the day Ellie had made him lemon cake and left it outside his door, untouched. Inside was a simple letter. "You don't have to be me. In fact, I pray you won't be. Let yourself love, even if it scares you, especially if it scares you." Clayton held the letter to his chest and wept. Real, broken tears that came from a place he hadn't touched in decades. Then he stood, walked to his father's old desk, and opened the drawer no one ever used. Inside was a small velvet box. He had seen it before. Once, a ring. Simple. Gold, understated, timeless. He took it without hesitation. The next morning, he left before dawn. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. The Kansas sky stretched wide above him, endless and humbling. The dirt roads led him past fields of wheat and weathered barns, through a town where no one recognized the name Redstone. He pulled into the gravel drive of the Whitmore farmhouse just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The house was quiet, painted white, front porch lined with potted marigolds. He stepped out of the car, heart pounding. No boardroom had ever made him this nervous. He climbed the steps slowly, knocked once. Then the door opened. Ellie stood there, framed by the soft porch light, wearing a loose sweater and jeans dusted with flour. Her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. His gaze dropped to her belly round now, unmistakably carrying not just one life, but two. Her hand rested gently over it, protective, instinctual. He swallowed hard. "I found the letter," he said, "from my father, about the lie." Still, she didn't speak, but she didn't close the door, either. He took a breath. "I came to ask if I could stay, not to fix what I broke, but to be the kind of man you believed I could be." And for the first time in his life, he waited. No power, no control. Just hope. They didn't speak. Not yet. But the silence between them was no longer made of absence, it was possibility. And as the wind rustled through the porch chimes, Clayton realized sometimes coming home meant coming undone first. The twins weren't supposed to come for another 5 weeks. But life, like love, doesn't always follow a schedule. It had started as a low ache, dull and distant, barely noticeable at first. Ellie had been folding a basket of baby clothes by the window, humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing when the wind grew wild across the Kansas fields. She was thinking about names. She had a short list, tucked in the back of her journal. One for a boy, one for a girl. She didn't know yet which would fit, but she was beginning to imagine their faces. Then came the second cramp, sharper. She paused, hand resting lightly on the swell of her belly. The babies kicked sometimes, especially at dusk, but this felt different, deeper. Like her body had just taken a breath it hadn't meant to. She stood slowly, testing her balance. The room spun just slightly, and something inside her shifted. A third wave of tightness gripped her lower back longer this time, more demanding. That's when she called out. Clayton. He was in the kitchen, slicing apples with her mother for the evening pie. His voice was casual, distracted. Did you want tea? Or she didn't answer, because by then, she was gripping the side of the doorway, breath shallow, eyes wide. He dropped the knife and reached her in seconds. Ellie, what's wrong, I think it's time, she whispered, voice trembling. Too early. But Clayton, I think they're coming. The hospital was 40 minutes away, but it felt like they were driving across a country. Rain had begun to fall, fine and silver, making the road shimmer in the fading light. Clayton gripped the steering wheel with one hand, the other never letting go of hers. She clutched his palm so tightly that her nails left half moons in his skin. But he never pulled away. Breathe, he kept saying. I'm right here. And for the first time, those words didn't feel like a formality. They felt like a promise. Inside the small town hospital, nurses moved quickly. Ellie was rushed into a room, monitors hooked up, machines humming. You're 5 centimeters, one of them said, calm but urgent. They're on their way. Mama. Clayton was given scrubs, gloves, a mask, but nothing prepared him for the way time warped inside that room, the way hours became minutes, and every second was a lifetime. Ellie was magnificent, not in a cinematic, glowing kind of way, but in the real way that women become warriors when life demands it. Her hair stuck to her forehead, her hands trembled, and she cried out when the pain rose like fire. But she did not waver. Not once. Clayton stood at her side the entire time, wiping sweat from her brow, whispering what little he could find of himself to offer. I'm sorry, he said once, voice cracking. I should have believed you. Ellie didn't answer. She just nodded, tears sliding down the curve of her cheek. And then a sound, high, urgent, undeniable, a cry. The doctor lifted a tiny, wriggling body into the air. It's a boy. Clayton didn't realize he was holding his breath until it came out in a ragged sob. The nurse placed the newborn in his arms, and something ancient, something primal, broke loose in him. He stared at the boy's face. His skin was red, his fists clenched, but those eyes, gray, storm gray, exactly like his own. Clayton pressed his lips to the boy's forehead, holding him like something holy, and he wept, not from shock, not from fear, but from the ache of all the time he'd spent believing he would never get this moment. Ellie watched him, her face pale from exertion, but shining with something far deeper. Love, forgiveness, exhaustion laced with grace. And just as the nurse turned to check the monitors again, a second cry broke the quiet, thinner, softer, delicate, like a bell in winter. Clayton looked up. Number 2's ready, the doctor said with a grin. A moment later, the tiniest baby he had ever seen was in the nurse's arms. A girl, came the announcement. Clayton blinked, stunned. 2 children, 1 moment, his world, turned inside out and wide open. Ellie reached for her, trembling. The nurse placed the baby gently on her chest. She was so small, barely bigger than a loaf of bread, but her lungs were strong. She's fierce, Ellie whispered, like your mother, but I pray she has your heart. Clayton sat beside her, cradling their son, and for the first time, their family was real, not on paper, not in theory, in breath, in blood, in heartbeat. They sat like that for a long time, no words, just quiet, just awe. Then a nurse returned with a clipboard and paused beside Clayton. "You have a daughter too," she said gently. "Would you like to hold her?" He turned to Ellie. She nodded, eyes heavy but warm, with reverent hands. He took the girl from her arms. She fit in the crook of his elbow like she'd been there all along, and when her tiny fingers curled around his thumb, something inside him finally settled. Not everything was fixed, not everything was forgiven, but this was the beginning of something worth fighting for. 2 babies, 2 second chances, and in the hush of a hospital room, Clayton Redstone, for the first time in his life, didn't feel like an empire, he felt like a father. Forgiveness doesn't come wrapped in bows or tied in perfect words. Sometimes, it comes with warm coffee and baby socks. Mornings came earlier now. Not because the sun rose faster over Kansas fields, but because 2 tiny humans demanded it loudly, without apology, with lungs that seemed far too strong for such small bodies. Clayton adjusted quickly, more quickly than Ellie expected. The man who once ran billion-dollar mergers now ran on 2 hours of sleep and an alarming amount of black coffee. He had traded boardrooms for bottle warmers, ties for burp cloths. At first, it felt like he was trying to prove something, but as the days passed, Ellie began to notice he wasn't performing. He was present. At 3 a.m., when their daughter refused to sleep unless rocked to the soft hum of old jazz, it was Clayton who held her. His voice low, his arms steady. He learned how to change diapers, though he never quite got the tabs right. He paced the kitchen floor with a fussy baby on his shoulder, while Ellie finally slept a full hour. He burned toast twice, but made perfect oatmeal on the 3rd try. He didn't talk much about what happened before, neither did Ellie, but forgiveness crept in, not as a thunderclap, but as a warm mug set beside her elbow when she looked too tired to ask, as a shared glance when the twins giggled at nothing, as hands meeting in the crib, adjusting a blanket together in silence. There were hard days, days when Ellie wondered if trust could truly rebuild from ruins. But then there were moments, little ones, like when Clayton whispered, "You've got this," during a rough feeding, or when he kissed the top of her head after she fell asleep on the couch with a baby on each side. Ellie hadn't forgotten the pain, but she had stopped holding it so tightly. And that, she realized, was the beginning of something new. One crisp Saturday, Clayton left early without a word. Ellie found a note on the counter, back by lunch. "Be good to your grandma. Kids." She laughed, half amused, half curious. He drove 3 hours straight to Charleston. Straight to the house he once called home, the manor that now felt more like a monument than a memory. Marilyn Redstone opened the door with perfect posture and unreadable eyes. "Clayton," she said, no hug, no warmth, just formality. He stepped inside anyway. The air smelled of lemon polish and distance. She led him to the sitting room, poured tea she knew he wouldn't drink. "I assume this is about her." He looked at his mother, truly looked. She had grown smaller, not in stature, but in presence, like power no longer clung to her. "I'm not here to fight," he said softly. She blinked. "I came to tell you I know what you did. About the doctor, the lie." Silence. Marilyn's eyes narrowed, just slightly. It was a long time ago, and it nearly cost me everything that matters. She set the teacup down with a quiet clink. Clayton leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You spent your life building an empire, but I want something else." A pause. Then, "Gently I choose them." Her breath caught, but she didn't argue. He stood, placing a single envelope on the table. Inside a photo of the twins, swaddled in matching blankets. No names, just faces. "I won't keep them from you, but you'll come to them on our terms. If you choose to." Then he left, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look back. that night. Ellie found him on the porch, rocking slowly in the chair her father had built long before her first heartbreak. He was holding something in his lap, a leather-bound book, worn but new. She sat beside him, arms crossed gently over her chest. The babies were finally asleep. Without speaking, he handed it to her. She opened it. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Grainy, zoomed in, some slightly out of focus. Ellie at the farmer's market in her second trimester. Ellie on the porch with her mother, smiling at a baby onesie. Ellie in the hospital, caught in the hallway light just before delivery. Tears welled in her eyes. I asked David to keep me updated. He said, voice low. I didn't want to intrude, but I couldn't stay away entirely. She flipped the page, a sonogram, then a shot of her hand resting on her belly, sunlight streaming through the curtains. I know I wasn't there, he added, not when it mattered most. But I was watching, hoping, wishing I'd been braver. She ran her hand over the page, the edges trembling. Then she closed the book, held it to her chest, and looked at him not with accusation, but with something quieter, deeper. You don't get to rewrite what happened, she said gently. I know, but you do get to help write what comes next. He nodded, and for the first time, Ellie didn't feel like she was standing alone at the edge of a storm. She felt seen, held, chosen. As the stars blinked into the Kansas sky, Clayton reached over, took her hand not to lead, not to convince, but simply to walk beside her. And for the first time in a long time, they both kept pace. Tell me a story, Mama, the little boy asked. Ellie smiled, because she had one, a real one, not from a book, not from make-believe, but from the quiet corners of her heart. The cottage sat on the edge of a lake just outside of town, framed by cottonwood trees and summer wind. 2 years had passed, but the memories of Charleston, of courtrooms and contracts and clipped conversations, felt like a distant dream. Their new home had no gates, no marble, no guards at the door, only wind chimes on the porch and muddy footprints by the back steps. Inside, life had softened. The twins, now 2 years old, were a blur of giggles, scraped knees, and endless questions. Their son, Jacob, was bold and observant. Their daughter, Grace, quieter but fearless, always reaching for butterflies or her father's shoelaces. And Ellie had learned to laugh again. Not just polite laughter, but deep, belly-full laughter that shook loose the fear lodged in her ribs for years. She had gone from secretary to mother, from quiet to clear, from watching life pass to living it. That night, Jacob tugged at her sleeve as she tucked him into bed. Tell me a story, Mama, not from the books, one that's true. She brushed a curl from his forehead. All right, she said, settling beside him. Once upon a time, there was a girl who worked in a tall, cold building where no one really smiled. Jacob's eyes widened. She was quiet. She answered phones. She wore the same shoes every Monday, and she never, ever imagined her name would one day be next to her boss's on a marriage certificate. He gasped. She married her boss. She smiled. She did, but not for love, not at first. Clayton stood quietly in the doorway, arms crossed, watching them. She married him because he needed help, because he was about to lose something very important. And even though he didn't say it, she loved him. She always had. Jacob snuggled into the blanket. Ellie continued, her voice softer now. And the boss. He didn't believe he could ever be a father, because someone once told him he couldn't, someone he trusted. At that, Clayton's gaze dropped to the floor, but the truth found its way out. Ellie said, gently, like it always does. And when it did, he realized he'd already lost the most important thing in his life. She glanced toward the doorway, but life gave him a second chance. Jacob blinked slowly. Did he take it? Ellie's voice caught, just slightly. Yes, she said. He did. Later, after both children were asleep, Ellie stepped onto the porch. The lake shimmered under moonlight. Crickets sang from the tall grass. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and waited. Clayton joined her, 2 mugs of tea in hand. They sat in silence for a while, letting the evening breathe between them. "You told them the story," he said eventually. "I did. And did you tell them how it ended?" She looked at him, her eyes warm. "I told them it's still being written." He reached for her hand, and then, quietly, she placed it over her stomach. He froze. "What?" She nodded, just once. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from fear, not from shock, but from the quiet beauty of a life growing again, where once there had been only ruin. "We're having another," she whispered. Clayton inhaled deeply, blinking hard. "Another chance?" he asked, voice trembling. "No," she said. "Another beginning." He kissed her then, slowly, not like a grand gesture, but like a thank you, like a vow he didn't need to speak anymore. They didn't fall in love all at once, but they stayed, and that made all the difference. In Charleston, Marilyn Redstone sat alone in the drawing room of her estate, a photo on her lap. 2 toddlers, sitting in a field of dandelions. A third on the way. No letter accompanied it, just a postmark and the family name, Redstone Whitmore. She smiled. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was real, and that was enough. Back by the lake, Clayton finished building a small wooden swing on the front tree, just wide enough for 2. Ellie watched from the porch, one hand resting on her stomach, the other holding Grace's tiny fingers. Jacob ran barefoot across the grass, chasing sunlight. The world didn't need to be perfect, only present, only honest, only held with care. "One day," Ellie whispered, "they'll ask how we made it." Clayton looked at her, eyes soft. "And what will you say?" She smiled. "We didn't fall in love all at once," she said, "but we stayed, and that made all the difference. Some loves don't begin with fireworks. They begin quietly in kindness, in patience, in the moments when no one's watching. This story reminds us that love is not always loud. It isn't always declared in grand gestures or perfect words. Sometimes, it's choosing to stay, choosing to forgive, choosing to believe in someone when they cannot believe in themselves. Ellie and Clayton teach us that second chances are rarely perfect. They're often messy, slow, and filled with doubt, but they are also deeply human. And when nurtured with grace, they bloom into something lasting. For anyone who's been hurt, who's had to start over, or who has loved someone who didn't yet know how to love, in return, this story is for you. It's a reminder that healing takes time, trust takes work, and that the greatest love stories are often not the ones that begin perfectly, but the ones that are rebuilt, piece by piece, after being broken. No matter how late in life it comes, real love is still possible, and it's always worth the wait. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story touched your heart, we'd be truly grateful if you could like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you more stories of hope, healing, and human connection. And if this reminded you of someone or even a part of your own journey, feel free to share it in the comments. We're always here to listen. Until next time, take care of your heart and each other.